Today I'm an assistant professor in this department, Languages and Linguistics, and today I'm going to share with you a little bit about my research. This is really cool because you guys have a better opportunity to see like what we do outside of our classroom, right? So if anybody's interested in learning about this more, I'm going to teach a class on this in the spring on some of the formalizations and stuff, so it definitely should be cool, undergrad and grad, the two. Sorry to pitch my class for the spring, but it should be interesting. So today I'm going to talk about communicating conjecture with a specific case of language contact. So we're going to take a look at one dialect that's considered a contact dialect or contact variety. So the objectives of my talk today, I'm going to present some interesting data from Yucatec Spanish. Specifically, I'll be talking about mood selection, subjunctive, indicative. I'm going to present like a brief argument of a framework that I think describes this nicely. And then in the end, I'm going to posit that this unanticipated mood selection that we see is actually an effect from the contact that we see between Spanish and Yucatec Maya in this area. All right, so first of all, Yucatec Spanish, what is this? We've got Mexico here, right here on the tip. We've got Yucatan, the peninsula. The state of Yucatan is up top. And then you can hear Yucatec Maya in all three of these states, in Yucatan, Campeche, and Quintana Roo. The state of Yucatan in general, about 25% of speakers report being bilingual in Yucatec Maya. And a lot of that is in like the big cities like Mérida. There's not as much bilingualism. The town where I did this research is called Valladolid. It's got a much higher rate of bilingualism, almost 50%. But again, when people report their levels of bilingualism, sometimes it's much higher than reported. So I would guess that it's much higher than 50% is bilingual in this area. So a little bit about what Yucatec Spanish sounds like. This is very tiny. I'm so sorry. All right. So Michnovitz says that it's an indigenous contact variety that's rapidly undergoing standardization as speakers reject these regional linguistic forms in favor of pan-Hispanic norms. What this means is we've got a lot of things that are very markedly Yucatec, right? So you listen and you go, it is Yucateco. And people are moving away from that because they want to do more of like a pan-Hispanic, more normalized Spanish, right? Previous research has found differences between bilingual and monolingual speakers in terms of their phonetics, their sound production, and their syntax, specifically the subject pronoun rates. So like here in US Spanish, we have higher rates of pronoun use of speakers of US Spanish. We see the same thing in Yucatec Spanish. And according to some of this previous research, bilingual speakers are able to identify primary distinctions, but more complex ones are a little trickier for them to figure out. So the example he gives, he works with phonetics. He says that bilingual speakers are able to acquire b, d, g, no problem. But when to use their approximate counterparts, the aproximantes, v, d, g, they're not so sure about that, right? There's some uncertainty with regard to that. So the bilingual speakers are not as good at distinguishing between the two. In some previous research I did, I found something very similar. So I'm looking at mood, and when mood is syntactically licensed, or when it's coming from, we can trace it through the syntax structure, pretty straightforward, everybody's got that mood down. But when it's pragmatically motivated, bilingual speakers aren't so good at that, right? It's interesting because in Yucatec Maya, there is no pragmatically motivated mood, right? So they're not as sensitive to that. One good example of that is cuando, right? We have the difference between habitual cuando and non-habitual cuando. One is subjunctive, one is indicative. Bilingual speakers of Yucatec Spanish just use subjunctive for all of them, right? So they don't make that distinction. All right. So the initial research I did, I was not looking for this. This is kind of my style of research. I like dive in, hoping to find something, and I always do. It works out. But so I was kind of like, all right, I want to see what the subjunctive looks like in general, right, in this area. So I give this big survey, and we've got a lot of verbs, epistemic predicates. So talking about like what it is. So it could be beliefs, it could be like estar seguro, all of these with the subjunctive or the indicative underneath. We're expecting, if I say estoy seguro, o estoy segura que, am I expecting the subjunctive or the indicative? Does anybody know? Estoy segura que puedo, estoy segura que pueda. Puedo, no? So we're expecting the indicative here. But I found 13.4% of my answers, and these were very carefully worded to be specific. 13.4 were subjunctive, and I was like, well, that's not an anticipated number, right? So I decided to do a little more research into this. Well, here's a good example. Estoy segura de que pueda encontrar el par perfecto. There was like 80% of my participants liked the subjunctive pueda for this, right? So I wanted to do a little follow-up, and I wanted to focus on just one kind of verb. So I looked at just creer, right? So you're presenting your beliefs with this. I did acceptability judgment interviews, which is really common in semantics, where I sit down and I give a context and I ask somebody about a sentence and I say, how does this sound to you? And they go, yeah, or no. And then we talk about why. And then if I've got some kind of pragmatic or contextual focus to the research, I change the context and try to force them. So if they're like, yeah, I like that, I try to change the context to force them into not liking it. Or if they don't like it, I change the context to force them into liking it. This sometimes can get weird, because there was one example, we were talking about going to the store, and we were talking about los videos. And so I was like, creo que los vende. And it was a reject completely. And I was like, okay, why? And he's explaining to me that it's really weird because los is masculine and men don't shop. Are you following me? No, you shouldn't be following me. This makes no sense, right? And so I was like, oh, that's very interesting. So we're not talking about like verbs, I'm like following, okay. Interesting. What if I went for so? Creo que la vende. It's like, perfecto. So it's really interesting to have these acceptability judgment interviews. If you don't study language, you don't know this information, so you have to kind of get around it. They take about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and we just discuss all of these contexts. I'm going to present some examples here. So the cool thing that happens in Yucatec Spanish is the subjunctive is permitted in affirmative. So I can say, creo que, for example here, can't really see that at all. Él cree que su amigo sea tramposo. In un español fronterizo, here, how does that sound? Right? Yes. People loved it in Yucatec Spanish, right? People say this all the time. And so here we have an example of the affirmative. I give a context. There's a whole bunch of contextualized examples that kind of run together. So this one, mi hermano me contó de su amigo, nunca aprueba los exámenes, pero ayer aprobó el examen con un 9.5 sin estudiar la información que estaba en el examen. So here I'm like, uh-oh, creating this context of maybe, right? And here the subjunctive of cree que su amigo sea tramposo works, right? We have a negated one as well. Ella no cree que él vaya. There's a preference for the subjunctive there. Not surprising, that's also okay in this dialect too, right? Got some others. This one was one that overwhelmingly was the subjunctive, right? Tengo que mover el sofá y le pregunto a mi vecina si su esposo me puede ayudar. Me dice que ahora no, porque no está en casa, pero, and then there was a preference for the subjunctive. Ella cree que él esté disponible esta tarde, right? What do you think? How does that sound to you guys? Yeah. This is a very marked feature of Yucatec Spanish, right? So, looking at this, we see that really the context is what shifts this interpretation. Whether it's subjunctive or indicative, this context really controls, because it's indicative if we're certain that it's happening, but if we're like not really sure if he cheated, or not really sure if that store sells those things, we're going to see the subjunctive regardless of whether it's no creo or creo, right? On both. So this really is controlled by the context set, all right? And so this is what we'll get to see next semester in some semantics, right? So we have a set of propositions, and a proposition is just an idea that we say, right? Communicate. So a set of propositions that the speaker takes for granted, and this is the common ground, right? So the stuff that we all know to be true, these are all part of the common ground, okay? What we know to be true in the world. And so the set of W, or what we know to be true in the world, of all possible worlds of what could possibly happen, that are compatible with every proposition in the common ground constitutes the context set. So if we're talking about somebody cheating on a text, this common ground is everything that everybody knows about tests, about that guy that might have cheated, about all of that. And then the context set is the relevant stuff, okay? So this is really clear that this is important in cases where both were accepted at really high rates. So for example, mi amiga me contó ayer de sus problemas con su esposo. Su comportamiento es sospechoso, dice que siempre sale sin decirle a dónde va por mucho tiempo. This context is really open, right? Ella cree que tiene amante, ella cree que tenga amante. And people really accepted both. When we continued talking and said things like, but I know he's not because he's taking dance classes to surprise her, boom, we went to the indicative, right? So if we knew that it was false, boom, indicative. But if I was like, I don't know, I've seen him and he's been a little weird, it might be true, then it stayed with that subjunctive. So it really was tied to this certainty, right? Or lack of certainty. So there's a theory in semantics called veridicality. And I'm gonna flash up some stuff, but you can just, if this is too much, just follow along, right? Semantics can be that way sometimes. All right, so non-veridicality is pretty much about the truth of a statement, or we're gonna talk about propositions, right? So here we have the idea, Paul saw a snake. That's our proposition that we're going to deal with. Paul saw a snake. And you can see that formalized here. We go, Paul saw a snake. And we know that it is true, or it equals one, for this first sentence. Paul saw a snake. True, right? We know that's true because we just said it happened. Paul did not see a snake. We revisit that proposition, Paul saw a snake. We know false, right? So we have veridical and anti-veridical. Now, if I ask you, did Paul see a snake? Revisiting that proposition, Paul saw a snake, we have no entailment that that's true. Like it could be that he did and it could be that he didn't, we have no idea. Same with a modal, may. Paul may have seen a snake. No entailment there, it could be either one. These two are called non-veridical environments. These are areas that are somewhere in between that truth or falsity, right? So other non-veridical contexts, with the case of belief, I don't think so. That would be a non-veridical context because maybe, maybe not. Modals like may. Downward entailing quantifiers, this would be like pocas personas or nadie. And then interrogatives, if we're asking a question, we're not saying it is or it isn't, right? And so pretty much what this theory is saying is that if it's veridical, in all worlds, that proposition is true. It is homogeneously true. All worlds, only possibility that it's true. If it's anti-veridical, all worlds, all possibilities, false. If it's non-veridical, you got a couple worlds in which it's true and a couple worlds in which it's false, right? So you got that nice combination. And several people have talked about this with the subjunctive, about how this subjunctive can communicate this kind of non-veridical interpretation. Not in Spanish, though. You see it in Italian, you see it in Greek, you see it in Hungarian. So it's really, you kind of have to sometimes step outside of the world of Spanish to be able to bring that back in to do an effective analysis, right? So this is kind of overall how you would describe, how I would describe mood, this unique case of mood in Yucatec Spanish, where all worlds are worlds in which P is true, right? So there is not a single world in which, well, maybe it's false. No, every single world P is true. And here we have some worlds in which P is true, and then some worlds in which P is false, right? So this is that formalization. It takes out any kind of ambiguity from our understanding. So my biggest question here is this a case of language contact? And I'll warn you now, I have an answer, but I'm not sure it's my final answer. So I'm just giving you a heads up ahead of time. So a little bit about Yucatec Maya. They communicate aspectual and modal information through pre-verbal markers. This means before the verb, you kind of understand a little bit about that verb, right? So here we have a pre-verbal marker, some, and this is the relative perfect, which means just a little bit ago, right? So it's communicating some temporal information. We have a compulsatory, yan, which means like we'll have to. So the verb, in Spanish, the verb communicates that information. In Maya, we have an extra particle that goes in front. And we say aspectual modal marker because there's a lot of times you can't tease them apart, right? So something like, I will have to, that has an aspectual future meaning and a modal future meaning. So you can't really tear those apart. So those are just some examples of these aspectual modal markers. And the subjunctive in Yucatec Maya is completely different than Spanish. It's used mostly temporally, and by that I mean with tense, right? So you can mark subjunctive as possible event realization in the future, so marking the future kind of like we do with cuando, right? Also counterfactuals, that's not as common, but you definitely see it. And then it can have past temporal reference, which is totally different than Spanish, right? So you had this a little while ago, I finished. You're marking that with, right here, the subjunctive, right? So this is a very different system. So if we were to go, okay, let's look at subjunctive in Maya and look at subjunctive in Spanish, maybe there's something there, we'd immediately go, no, there's not, right? Because it's not the same at all. Subjunctive in Spanish is modal, it communicates possibility, certainty, all of that information, more pragmatic. But what we've got here is temporal, so definitely not contact. But I don't think that's the case. So, yeah. They have these markers in Yucatec Maya called, the category is called conjectural markers. And conjecture is when you're kind of like not sure about something, right? You don't know 100% that something is true. So we have mean, which you put just in front of that verb again, and it marks something similar to creo, right? So you can communicate that like, I mean, I think, but I don't know, right? With this one word, mean. There's also